What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and in today's episode of the Fighting Game Tutorial Series, we are going to be going over pop-ups for our news entries and patch notes. When we come into the game here, we can launch our main menu, and the main menu will create a news pop-up if there is news that we have not read yet. I want to give a huge shout out to my YouTube membership and Patreon members and supporters, as well as the new Discord subscribers. Thank you guys for all the love, all the support over the years. We have a fantastic project, a fantastic product because of you guys, and I'm so happy that you're enjoying it as much as I am. If you'd like to get caught up in the series before watching this episode, you can check out all 206 other episodes at this link right here. You can check out how we've done our launching, our attacks, our animations, and all that fun stuff. Alternatively, if you only care about the news pop-up and the patch notes, I recommend you watch this episode right here, which is where we created the main menu, and we are going to be using that to create the news pop-up today, so it would be good if you already had that logic down before entering this episode. This tutorial series is a code and blueprint tutorial series, so we're going to be doing both C++ and blueprint. We're going to start in the code today, and specifically we want to go to our base game instance.h. In the base game instance, we can scroll down to where we want to make our structure. We're going to make a new structure for news entries. So basically, anytime we want to push news, we can make an instance of this structure, and we can tell the game to put it out there for the players. Once the players have read that entry, we can mark the entry as having been read. And once we do that, we won't automatically show that news entry when the game loads up. But before that point, when it's a new entry and the user hasn't read it yet, we want to display it to them automatically upon loading the game. So I went below my other structures here and I've added a new one. I made sure the structure was blueprint type. So use struct blueprint type. That way we can access it in the blueprint. Then I made the structure by typing struct space and then the name of the struct, which is f news entry in my case. As with all of our other structs, I'm going to use the generated body macro to make sure everything gets set up properly within the structure. Notice there's no semicolon at the end of these macros. You don't have to put a semicolon at the end of this line, just the same as uProperties and uFunctions. Then after that, I put the public keyword with a colon to put all these variables in the public scope so that other classes can access them freely. And then I make all my variables related to the news entry. So the first one I have is an f text for the title. Next one is an f text for the description. Third one is a uTextured2D pointer for the background. And the fourth and final one is a boolean was read. All of them share the same uProperty. So make sure you put uProperty, edit anywhere, blueprint read write with the category of news up at the top. And this will allow us to access it and edit in the blueprint as well as find it more easily by looking for the news category. Now, the title is going to be the title that you saw in the pop-up earlier in the episode. So it's going to be the main text. The description is going to be the longer text that actually explains what was updated or a new event that's out, whatever the case may be. The background is going to be the actual image that we use. You could have a standard background and put an image over top of that, or you could change the entire background. You saw in the demo, I was able to have different backgrounds for my news entries, so it's up to you how you want to handle that. But for me, I just have one texture 2D, and that's for my overall background. Then was read determines if the player has read it or not yet. Again, once the player reads it, we don't want to open it automatically. So this is important to know if it's already been read by the player or not. If they want to open the news pop up again throughout the game, we can definitely let them do that, and then it doesn't matter if they read it or not. But as for automatically popping it up, we definitely need to know if they have read it or not. Once your structure is made, you can scroll down to where you make your variables, and we're going to add a new array. And I call it news entries. It's a T array of the new structure that we just made, f news entry, called news entries. I also made this variable uProperty of edit anywhere, blueprint read write with the category of news, so I can find it just as easily in the blueprint as any of the structure variables. This array is basically going to hold every single news entry that we have. We're going to add them. Essentially, when we load into the game, we'll set all the news entries that are still relevant in this array, and the player will be able to read them. And then when updates come out, whether it be the server making the news entries or manual work that we do as developers, we actually push out these news entries. They will go to this array and the player will have access to all of them. So even if the events have ended, if you want to keep them, you could do so by keeping them in this array, or you could eventually clear them out. That way the players only have what is relevant to them at the current time. Regardless of how you want to handle that, we still want an array for our news entries. So here's how we've done that. Now, you don't have to do anything in the base game instance.cpp for that behavior because we don't know the size of the array yet. We don't need to reserve space in that array or try and add elements to it just yet. We should have a function, however, to display the oldest piece of news that is still relevant that the player has not read. You've probably seen this in games where they have multiple announcements. They probably all didn't come out on the same day. They came out on different days, but if multiple are still relevant, we want to read the oldest to the newest. Or you could reverse it and read the newest to the oldest. But regardless, the player should be able to see all those pieces of news. And so now I'm going to where my functions are in my base game instance, and I'm making a new function called determine news to display. And it is ufunction blueprint callable, so we can call it in the blueprint, and it is an integer type, meaning it returns an integer. It is going to return the index in the news entries array that we just created of which entry to display. This will allow us to pick the correct news option to display to the player if there are multiple available. And by correct, I just mean either the most recent or the oldest, depending on your preferences, or potentially the most relevant. You might not even care about the date, but you have something in particular that you want to supersede everything else. You could do that as well. Once you make this function the .h file, let's go to the base game instance.cpp, scroll down to where we want to make the function. I've created it right here. Determine news to display. So int ubasegame instance : determine news to display. And the first thing I'm going to do is find the oldest unread news entry. I am going to create a standard for loop to loop through all the news entries by doing for integer I equals 0. I is less than the news entries .num ++ I. Basically, start at the first index in the array, continue looping through until we reach the last index in the array, and increment I every iteration of the for loop. Now, once we get to each index, we want to see if the news entry at index I was read. If it's not read, notice the exclamation mark, that means that the player has not read this, and this is the oldest entry in the array. I started 0, and in my example, they're being added chronologically. So the oldest one is the first index, the newest one is the last index. As soon as I find one that hasn't been read by the player, I want to go ahead and return that value. So not news entries I .was read means I should return that entry. If you wanted to determine the newest unread news entry, you could loop through this backward and do the same process. Once this for loop is done, no matter which one you chose, if you don't find an index, if it doesn't hit this return, it will finish this for loop and fall out of it. At that point, we still need to return something, and we want to return a value that we know is not accurate, such as -1. If we return -1, we can assume that all the news has been read, and we don't have to necessarily open any entries. We can just leave it blank, and the player can go about playing the game until a new entry is added to the game. If all news entries have been read, don't return any entries. Return -1. Alright, that is all the code that we need to do today. Now we need to go into the editor and actually create our widget. Now that the editor is back open, we want to go to where we want to create the widget. I'm going to create it in my menus folder. I'm going to add user interface widget blueprint. If you're doing this in Unreal Engine 5, this will still work. It'll just be a slightly different starting point. So once you create a new one, you can come into it, and I called mine the news pop-up. In Unreal Engine 4, when you come in here, you will have a canvas panel to start. In Unreal Engine 5, you will not. You don't actually need this canvas panel, but if you do want to add one, you can still add it. So you can search for canvas panel and just drag it into the widget. Now, you can see these are my settings for the canvas panel. They're all default, so you don't have to change anything. So if you want to follow it directly and you're in Unreal Engine 5, feel free to add that canvas panel, but it's not required. Now, the things that I did add are a background image. This is the image we're going to change, so I could make it about a new stage. It could be a picture of the stage, a new character, it could be a picture of the character, whatever I want it to be. The title which is the actual title of the pop-up or the update or the news entry, whatever we're calling it. So in my case, I say patch notes version update. That's just template text. Of course, we can make it whatever we want. Then I have a pop-up description, which is where I put the actual information about the patch notes and other updates. So you can see I've written that out here. So the background is an image widget brought into the canvas panel, and I've called it pop-up background and made sure that it was a variable. That way we can change it. I anchored it to the center of the widget, and here are my sizes if you want to use them. I also changed my Z order to -10. That way I know it will be behind the title and the description. For the brush, I didn't actually give it a default image. I can give it a default image. I can put in whatever image I want here. If I put in a material or something, it will try to work, but if it's not a UI material, it won't actually allow us to put it. But we can put textures and actual images in here. So I can put whatever image I want. But I actually just took out the image and left it as a solid color. And to do that, I selected my tint section here and changed it to the color I wanted. Now I actually left it as gray, so 0.5, 0.5, 0.5 for RGB and 1 for the alpha, but again, make it whatever color you want. This is the size of the image of that texture. Really, it's just the size of the box. So if I change that value, it doesn't change anything because the image is currently taking up the size for this slot. And I'll scroll down and show you the rest of my settings, but everything else is default in here. So that's my pop-up background. Now I have the title, which is just a text element that I've added to this widget. And I've called it pop-up title and made sure that it is a variable, again, so we can change it. I anchored it to the center, and here are my values for everything. I changed my alignment to 0.5 on the X and Y. That way this is centered. Typically, when you have text, it works off of the left and the top of the widget, or the top left of the widget. So if I do that, it changes where the position is drastically. I want it to be centered by the text element and the text widget itself. So cutting both of those in half will put it middle horizontally and middle vertically. I put in some basic text by default. That's what you're seeing on the screen right here. Then for the font, I picked my size and my outline size that I wanted for the effect that I wanted and made sure the justification was in the center. Then everything else was the same as a default text element. Lastly, we have our pop-up description, which is another text element here called pop-up description that is a variable. This one was anchored to the bottom center. And here are my values for these. Alignment is the same, 0.5 on each. Put in some template text. Here is my font settings for my size and my outline. Justification of middle. And I do have it as auto wrapping the text. That way, if the text goes over, it will go to the next line automatically. Speaking of that, we probably should do that for the title. Even though I didn't allocate space for it, it would be a good idea if it's big enough. So I'll go ahead and check that too. So you'll see if I add a bunch of characters, it's going to automatically wrap it for us. So there we go. That is how we created the news pop-up widget. Now let's go into the graph and specifically go to the event construct. I've actually removed all the other events that spawn in here by default, so I only have event construct. If you don't have this for any reason, you can always search for it and get it back. You'll get this node right here. Now there's really only two things we need to be able to do with this. You could make yours a lot more advanced, but the first thing I'm going to do is set the data on this pop-up to be accurate based on the information we give it. So if we change the title, the description, and the image, I expect that to be reflected on this pop-up. Additionally, I want to be able to exit the pop-up some way, and I'm doing that by pressing our back button. So however we press the back button in our game to go back menus, I want to use that to close this news pop-up. Let's start with the first one, which is this function setNewsData. It's a function that I made. It's a plus function called setNewsData. And we're going to set our title, description, and background in here. But to do that, we need to know what we're setting it to. So I've actually added a variable to this widget, plus variable, and I've made it of type the news entry, which is the structure that we made in the game instance. So once I make my variable, I called it news entry ref, and for the variable type, I can just click on the drop down and search for news entry. Should pop up. At this point, I can select it, and that is my variable type. Now, additionally, I want to set it immediately upon spawning this widget, because we're going to spawn it from the main menu, and the main menu has a reference to the game instance, and the game instance will hold this data. So we can spawn it from the main menu and pass the data along from the main menu to this widget. And to do that, if we make this variable instance editable and expose on spawn, we will be able to see it while we're spawning the widget, and we will be able to pass data into it. You can also assign it a default value if you want. I haven't done that. Mine's all blank, but feel free to if you'd like to. Now, once we have this variable in here, we can drag it into the graph and get it. Then we can drag off of it to break it, break news entry, and that will allow us to get all the variables from the structure. And we're going to need at least the 3 of them for this function. If you have more than this, you can of course update it and add those ones as well. But for today's episode, I only needed the title, description, and background. Additionally, if you don't want to show all your variables that you don't need in this function, you can click on your break node and uncheck ones that you don't need. So I don't need was red in here, so I can uncheck that. It'll go away on the break and make it a little bit cleaner. Now, at this point, we have the actual news entry that we want to display to the player. It has a title, a description, and a background, and so we can use those to set our variables that we have on this widget. First things first is the title. So I take my pop-up title variable, get it, and say set text, and it's going to have text in parentheses. Then we can pass in the title directly into that. And so now the text that is on our pop-up title text element here is going to update to whatever was in this news entry. We are going to do the same thing for the pop-up description. So we're going to get it, set text, just like this, and I want to pass the description into it. Lastly, we have our background. Now, I made the background a textured 2D because I only needed the picture itself. The pop-up background is an image. And so when you have an image, you can say set brush to set a bunch of things about it. I've done set brush, and then I passed the background into that. So let's grab our pop-up background and get it. Then we can drag off of that and type set brush. If you try and do set image, for example, nothing will come up. So make sure you do set brush. And then you'll have this in brush pin here. You can right click on it and split the struct pin to get everything about the brush. At this point, I want to pass the background into the in brush image. You can change all these other parameters as well if you'd like, but I didn't need to. And then eventually you'll get this result for your function. So this is set news data. Let's make sure we go back into the event graph in the event construct and call this function. We can just drag it onto the screen or search for it. Now all of our data is set up correctly, and the widget actually should be displaying proper information to the player. The next thing we need to do is figure out how to exit out of the widget. So to exit out of it, we need to listen for an input action. And the input action we're going to listen for is whatever button we use to return from that menu. So in our project, I use the backspace key on my keyboard or the B button on my Xbox controller, and we will return from the menu we're in. If you have inputs like that, those will work. Or additionally, you could have a button on the widget that you press with your mouse. You can click on it and press back. That would also work, however you want to handle it. For me, listen for input action will be enough. So listen for input action. And this allows you to pass in an action name and call an event when something happens on that name. So we want to call the event on this widget. So target is self. The action name is found in our project settings. It is under the input. You can see all of our action mappings, and you can pass in the one that you want. So return P1 is what I used. Again, backspace or the B button on an Xbox controller. Now at this point, we want to pass in that name, return P1, and I want it to occur when we press it. So when we press those buttons, that's when we're going to call the event. It doesn't need to consume input. Consume input means that if this widget gets this input, we won't allow other widgets to get their inputs. I'm going to show you how to avoid moving around on the main menu screen when we have the news up. So it's not required that you use this. And for the callback, we can drag off of it and type add custom event. And we'll get this right here. Then you can rename the event to whatever you want. So I called it return P1, but you could say close pop-up, for example. Up to you. So whether or not the player actually read the update, the pop-up, the news entry, I'm going to say once the pop-up is closed, we are going to consider that news entry as read. Basically, the player has clicked into it, so we know that they have had the ability to see it. We already have a reference to the news entry that was used to generate the information for this pop-up, so we can drag it into the graph here and get it. We can actually drag off of it and type set members in news entry. And this will allow us to change values within this structure. Since this takes in a struct reference, we will actually change the values in this reference. So once you have this node, you can click on the set members and actually toggle what you want to set. Don't toggle them all unless you're going to change them, because if I toggle them and I leave them empty like this, it's going to think that we want to actually change this to be an empty value, which we don't want. The only one I want to change is the was read. So if I toggle that one, you'll see was read appears in the set members node here. Then I can click on it to toggle it to be true, because at this point we're saying we've read it. Once we do that, we can remove the pop-up from the screen by calling remove from parent. So remove from parent basically just removes this widget from the parent widget, and in this case it's on the viewport, so once we remove this widget, it will delete it from the viewport and we won't see it anymore. At that point, our news pop-up widget is successfully created. Now we have to go spawn it in the main menu screen. So I'm going to go onto my main menu screen widget, and I'm going to go to the graph. Here's my event construct. I'm going to scroll over to the end of event construct. Everything that you saw before this was already part of this event in the series, so only the highlighted content is new and required for today's episode. Now, we haven't added anything to the news entries array yet, so it's going to be empty right now, but we can still fill out all the behavior to spawn the news pop-up widget, and then the last thing we will do is add the elements to the news entries array. First things first, we already have a game instance reference from earlier in our event construct. It's actually the first thing that we do when we get into event construct. If you don't, you can add it now. We want to use this to grab the news entries array as well as call the determine news to display function. We can use our game instance ref, get it, say news entries and get them, get that array, and then call determine news to display. Remember that determine news to display returns an integer, and if that integer is anything other than -1, it has found an unread news entry. However, if it is -1 or somehow less than that, we'll know that it is not a valid entry to grab from the news entries array, and so we want to skip spawning the pop-up. So as soon as I call this function, I drag off the return value and type greater than, an integer greater than integer, and it has to be greater than -1, otherwise we don't want to spawn the pop-up. This greater than node returns a boolean, which we can then bring into a branch, and so if the return value is greater than -1, true, we can continue on. If it's false, we're just going to leave it alone. We're not going to do anything with it. You can see that here. Now, assuming it is true, we want to use the return value from determine news to display to get that index of the news entries to display that to the user. So we can drag off of news entries and type get. We're going to get a reference in this case because we may want to change things on it or edit things on it, such as the wasRead variable that we do edit in the news pop-up widget. And we want to take our return value and pass that into the get. So we are going to that index to grab the information. Now we can actually create the news pop-up widget by saying create widget and changing the class to our news pop-up widget, which is right here. Now, since we had made the news entry ref on the news pop-up instance editable and expose on spawn, we can drag in the result that we got from this get node here into the news entry ref, and now this reference will be whatever value we returned from the determined news to display. We don't really need to set an owning player here since we're on the main menu. We only allow player 1 to control this menu. But if you'd like to, you could definitely pass in your player controller 0 and set the owner. Remember to only do this create from the true of the branch. Lastly, we need to add this to the viewport so we can drag off of our return value. This is the news pop-up widget that was created, and type add to viewport. Once we do this, nothing is going to pop up by default because the main menu screen is going to be the leader. It's going to be the root. It's going to be the highest priority. It's going to be showing above this widget that we create. However, we can press the little down arrow here to change the Z order. And this Z order isn't the same as the Z order on this screen. So for example, this background Z order of -2 isn't the same as the Z order in here. They mean the same thing, but this Z order specifically refers to widgets. So it doesn't matter the elements on the widget. It's not going to change that and like go between elements on a different widget. But if we change the Z order to 1, it's going to put the pop-up above the main menu screen widget. So now I'm going to delete this, and this is what you're left with. And that is how you can spawn your news pop-up widget to the screen. We now need to add our actual news entries to our news entries array. And there's a few methods you could use to do this. You could create a data table in here in the editor, and to do that you would want to go to your base game instance.h and scroll down to the structure that we made, our news entry structure. You would need to add :f table row base. You can see I've done it in my other structures here for my unlockables. That's public f table row base. If you do this, you will be able to select this structure when creating a data table, and then you could fill out the information. But I'm actually going to show you another method. We're going to do this all in the code in the constructor of the base game instance. So we'll go to the CPP file, and we'll scroll down a little bit. Now, you'll see everything that I'm highlighting here is what we're adding at this point. This is how we're creating the element in this array and setting all the data for it. So similarly to how we handled the macro inputs, you see that I call news entries.setNum1. This allows me to put one element in the array, so that way I can access that index. Right now we only care about one news entry, so 1 is fine. Now I need to go and set up all the data for this specific news entry that we just created. So you see I can do news entries 0.title equals, and then we can set it equal to the string that we want. Remember that the title is actually an ftext type, not an fstring. So when we get the string that we want, which is the fighting game continues to improve, I still need to convert that to an ftext to be able to use it. And we can do that using the ftext : from string function. This allows us to put in a string and retrieve a text element. It'll basically convert it to text for us so we can assign our variable. Now what we want to do is do the same thing for the description, and you can say I put the text in here. Updates are great. Let's keep improving the game as a community, and I'm still using that ftext : from string function. The next thing we're going to do is set the background of the news entry, or the image. This one is a little bit more complicated. For this, we can use something called construction helpers. So you see I have static construction helpers : f object finder. And what this will do is find an object based on the path that we give it. So we can actually find the texture that we want to use for our UTexture2D, which is what the image for the news item is. So we want to find our image that we want for the background for the news entry. And you see after the f object finder part, we have the UTexture2D. That's because the object we're finding is of that type. So in the angled brackets, you put the type that you're trying to find. So up to this point, That is all the variable type. We're just trying to track the variable type. Then we have to name it just like regular variables. So here is my name for it. That is news entry background texture. And this is going to be our uTexture2D, like I mentioned earlier. Now we have to put the text macro and then put the actual path that we want to use to find this object. Now the way we actually do this is put the quotes and then the type that we're going to fill out, which is a texture2D. That's what we're trying to find. Then you'll see a single quote followed by the actual path of the object. So we have the /game folder. /game is actually our project and the content folder. That's where /game leads us to. After that, we're just going to follow the folders like they're labeled in the File Explorer or when you're in the content browser in Unreal Engine. So here is my project, and again, we're going into the /game folder, which is actually our content folder. So we're going to go in content. And then following it from here, the next folder is the art folder. So we can see that the art folder is right here in the list. It's the first element. So I can go ahead and select it and go into that. The next thing in the path is the levels folder, which is right here in this list. We can go into that. And the specific texture image that I'm trying to use here is this default level icon. You'll notice I don't have PNG or anything like that. I'm actually using the U asset itself in the folder. So I don't need a file extension. However, you can see the PNG is in this folder as well as the U asset. Then I have an ending single quote followed by an ending quote for the entire string. And at that point, our fObject finder should be able to find the object we're looking for. At this point, we can check to see if this returned a valid result. So once we do this operation, the news entry background texture .object will be filled out. If it is true, that's what this first if statement is here, that means we have found an object at that path of this type, and thus we can set news entries 0.background to the news entry background texture .object. If we hit the else statement, that means we didn't find an object at that path, in which case we want to set the news entry 0.background to null pointer. Setting it to null pointer will avoid a crash, but we won't display any sort of texture image for that slot. Then after that, we just want to make sure we set num entry 0.wasRead to false because this is a new entry and by default it should not be read, so we're setting it to false. We need to go back to our news pop-up, our widget here, because this logic does work for setting that specific structure reference. However, our structure is in an array, and we need to set the array element back to this value that we changed. To do that, we can get our game instance and use that to be able to get our array that we have, our news entries array, and change the value. So I'm going to move everything over. That way we can have a little bit of room here. I'm going to get game instance and cast it to the base game instance. We're going to hook this up, and we're going to drag off of the base game instance where our array will be. And we're going to search for news entries, and we're going to get it. And from this array, we can type find item, or just find, and select this one right here. And we'll be able to find an element in this array. If we find a matching structure, it will return the index that it is at. And that's going to be important because we need to use the news entry ref to replace the element that's currently in the array at that index. So we're going to put news entry ref in here. Then you can see that we have this return integer off of the find item node. So we can drag off the news entries array, type set array elem for set array element, and this will allow us to modify a value in the array at a given index. So we're going to plug this in, and we're going to take that return from the find and pass it into the index. Clean it up a little bit here, and now we can actually right click on the item and split it. Split it into its basic components, the title, description, background, and wasRead. And we can break the news entry ref that we currently have and set everything in there by passing in the title, the description, the background, and we're going to leave wasRead out because remember, we're setting that array element. So I'm going to manually check it on the set array element. I'm not going to pass it in because right now the news entry ref has it as false. We can also hide the wasRead boolean from the break here if we want to. That way we don't accidentally plug it in the future and no mistakes happen. This actually makes the set members in news entry irrelevant at this point. So we will be able to get rid of that once we get rid of the set members. we can drag it into the remove from parent, and that logic will now update the array. Now if we play the game, the news pop-up will come up, and if I close it and go into another menu such as the versus menu and exit back out to the main menu, it should not pop up again because we have already read it. We do not save this data out, all the data in the array will reset, and if we relaunch the game, the news pop-up will come up again. That is working as intended, so now our was read is being set correctly, and players can get their news only when they should. The final thing we need to do is make it so the main menu and its elements are not being moved or confirmed while we are in the news pop-up. So if we go back into our main menu screen, we can make a new variable, and we're gonna call it is news pop-up open, just like our other booleans that we have for the session list and the quick game pop-up, all that good stuff. We want to say that this pop-up or this menu is open, so we can simply drag the boolean onto the screen and set it to true by checking the box. At this point, the news pop-up is open. Our move selection and confirm selections are the things that we're trying to block with this boolean, so we want to go into each of those functions and check for that value. In move selection, I have this OR with my 3 other previous checks that I had. I've added a new one by pressing add pin and connecting the new boolean to that value. We can do that by dragging it onto the screen and getting it. Now the confirm selection has the same deal. So you'll see here that I have this OR checking for all the conditions, but if we press add pin and add a new one, we'll want to connect our is news pop-up open. Now we need to swap over to our news pop-up once more, go into the graph, and you'll see that we have updated it a little bit. So we still have everything that we showed just earlier. It's all right here. We've really only added 2 other nodes here, and to do this, we need to add a variable. This variable is going to track the widget that created the news pop-up. In that case, it is our main menu screen, so I've called it creator widget ref, but you can see it as of the main menu screen widget object reference type. So right there, and it doesn't have any default values or anything, but it references this class that created it, and that's because that widget that created it, the main menu screen, has the is news pop-up open boolean, which we need to set to false when we're closing this pop-up. You'll notice that instance editable and expose on spawn are checked on this variable. That way we can edit it as soon as we create this widget. So now if we go back to the main menu screen, you can see that I have this spot where I'm creating the news pop-up widget. Here, if I refresh this node, you should see this pin pop up, and now I can drag off of it and get a reference to self, because self is the main menu screen widget, and that's what we want to be the creator widget reference here. So drag off, get a reference to self, and we'll get what you see right here. Now we can go back to the news pop-up. What we want to do is get our creator widget ref and make sure that it is valid. Only if it is valid do we want to do this. But if it is valid, we want to set our boolean. So we're going to get it, we're going to right click, we are going to convert it to a validated get. We're going to drag off of it and search for that boolean that is news pop-up open. We're going to set that to false. So just leave it unchecked. After this, we can just make sure to drag the execution line into the remove from parent, and if the creator widget reference is invalid, we also want to remove from parent. We just won't set that boolean to be false. At that point, guys, we are good to go, so thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode and it helped you make your patch notes or news updates available in your game. If it did, please subscribe and consider joining the Patreon, YouTube membership, or Discord subscriptions. I really appreciate it and it helps out the channel a lot. If any of you ran into any issues with this episode or any of my tutorials, feel free to join the Discord community. There is a link in the description and I would be happy to help you. Otherwise, guys, that is all I got. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.